In the spring of 1945, the United States was weeks away from ending the war in the Pacific. The Manhattan Project was nearing completion. Scientists at Los Alamos were preparing the devices that would within months destroy 2 Japanese cities. And inside half a dozen American hospitals, the same scientific apparatus was quietly running a second program, one that did not involve enemy combatants, and one that was never declared. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government conducted radiation experiments on its own citizens without their consent. The subjects included pregnant women, newborn babies, cancer patients, hospitalized workers, and institutionalized children. The records were classified. The patients were tracked as case numbers. And when the documentation was finally forced into the open in 1994, the apology that followed was not accompanied by criminal charges, revoked licenses, or dismantled institutions. Stay with us to find out who they injected, why they chose those people specifically, and why the people responsible died of old age with their reputations and their pensions intact. The story I am covering today is truly one of the most chilling that I've come across so far, and that's a bold statement considering some of my previous topics. And what separates this story from many of the others I cover on this channel is that almost none of it is in dispute. The plutonium injections happened. Every name, every date, every dose, and every institutional protocol I am about to describe was either declassified by the United States government under congressional pressure or entered into the public record through sworn testimony before the President's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in 1994. The documents exist. The institutions are still operating. The names of the victims are known. What is open to interpretation is not whether the experiments occurred. It is what their occurrence tells us about the system that produced them, and whether that system has actually changed since. That is the question this video is going to leave you with. Let me start with what plutonium actually does to a human body, because the men who designed these injection protocols knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a case of primitive science or innocent ignorance. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. When it enters the bloodstream, it does not pass through the body. It lodges in the bone marrow, the liver, and the lymphatic system. From those positions, it delivers a slow, concentrated dose of radiation to surrounding tissue for the rest of the person's life. The scientists running the Manhattan Project understood this in clinical detail. They had spent years studying the effects of radium on the women who had painted watch dials in the 1920s, workers who had ingested trace amounts of radium by licking their brushes to find the point, and who had subsequently died of bone cancer, jaw necrosis, and other consequences that took the medical profession decades to fully document. By the time plutonium entered the equation, the research community already knew that bone-seeking radionuclides were not substances that could be administered to a human being with uncertain outcomes. The outcomes were known. The only question was the timeline. To establish the timeline, the Manhattan Project's medical division needed human subjects. The official justification was occupational safety. Workers handling fissile material were being exposed to radiation, and the existing exposure standards were based on theoretical models rather than empirical data. The argument made internally was that real numbers were required to protect future workers. The argument made externally, to the subjects themselves, was that they were receiving treatment for the conditions that had brought them into the hospital. Neither argument required the subjects to be told what was actually in the syringe. The first documented case was a man identified in the declassified files as subject HP12. His real name was Ebbcade. He was 53 years old, an African-American construction worker employed at the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee. On March 24, 1945, he was involved in a car accident and brought to the Oak Ridge Hospital with a broken arm and a broken leg. He was otherwise in good health. While he was being prepared for orthopedic treatment, before his bones had even been set, hospital staff injected him with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium-239. He was not told. His family was not told. Over the following months, 15 of his teeth were extracted and bone samples were removed from his body for analysis. The procedures were described to him as part of his ongoing treatment. They were not. They were data collection. He was released, returned to work, and lived for another 8 years before dying of heart failure in 1953. The role the plutonium injection played in his death was never investigated. His family did not learn what had been done to him until the declassification process of the 1990s almost 50 years after the fact. Between 1945 and 1947, at least 18 American citizens were injected with plutonium under variations of the same protocol. The institutions involved included the University of California in San Francisco, the University of Chicago's Billings Hospital, Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, and Presbyterian Hospital in San Francisco. The selection criteria were consistent. The subjects were patients who had been admitted for other conditions. They were people whose existing prognoses were uncertain enough that any future health decline could plausibly be attributed to their pre-existing illness rather than to the experimental injection. Cancer patients, accident victims, people in late middle age with chronic conditions, people whose deaths, when they came, would not raise questions. One of the most carefully documented cases is that of Albert Stevens. He was 58 years old when he was admitted to the University of California Hospital in San Francisco in May of 1945. He had been diagnosed with what his physicians believed was terminal stomach cancer. He was injected with a solution containing two isotopes of plutonium, plutonium-238 and plutonium-239. The diagnosis turned out to be wrong. Stevens did not have terminal cancer. He had a benign gastric ulcer. He recovered and lived for another 21 years. During those 21 years, his urine and feces were periodically collected and analysed by researchers who never told him why his samples were being requested. He had no idea he had been injected with plutonium. He had no idea his body was being tracked. When he died in 1966, his ashes were collected without his family's knowledge and analysed for residual plutonium content. The documentation on Stevens is so clinically precise, so completely stripped of any sense that he was a person rather than a measurement set, that researchers who eventually read the files in the 1990s came away describing the encounter as something that stayed with them long after they had closed the folders. Stevens had been kept alive and observed for 2 decades as a scientific instrument. The institution that did it understood that no member of his family was ever likely to discover what had happened, and that calculation turned out to be accurate. This is where the pattern of selection becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The subjects of these experiments were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they were vulnerable, because they were poor, because they were black, because they had developmental disabilities, because they were pregnant women seeking prenatal care they could not afford, because they were patients who had already ceded a degree of autonomy to the medical system, because they were children whose parents trusted that the people in white coats were there to help them. The experimenters relied on that trust. They designed their protocols specifically to exploit the gap between what a patient believes is happening and what is actually being done to them. The architecture was not accidental, it was the point. In the same year that ebbcade was being injected at Oak Ridge, doctors at Vanderbilt University in Nashville were enrolling poor pregnant women in a separate study. These women came to the prenatal clinic seeking care they could not otherwise afford. They were told they were being given a special vitamin cocktail to support their pregnancies. What they were actually being given was a solution containing radioactive iron, a tracer element that allowed the researchers to study iron absorption and fetal development. The women were not told the cocktails were radioactive. Their husbands were not told. At least 3 of the children born from those pregnancies later developed cancers in childhood. One of them died. When the Vanderbilt study was finally examined publicly in the 1990s, the university acknowledged that it had taken place but offered no complete accounting of how many women had been enrolled or what the full health consequences had been. The pattern continued and expanded after the war. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, beginning in 1946, researchers from MIT and Harvard recruited boys who lived at the institution into what was described to them as a science club. The boys had been placed at Fernald by families who could not provide for them at home, often because of developmental disabilities. The parents who signed consent forms were told their sons would receive better food as a benefit of joining the club. The consent forms did not mention that the oatmeal being served to club members contained radioactive iron and calcium tracers. The cereal was supplied by Quaker Oats. The research was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission. The boys ate the oatmeal, their bodies were tracked. The study continued for years. When the surviving subjects discovered what had happened to them and filed a lawsuit in the 1990s, the case was settled in 1998 for an undisclosed amount. The settlement included a medical monitoring fund. No criminal charges were brought against anyone at MIT, Harvard, Quaker Oats, or the Atomic Energy Commission. In Cincinnati, between 1960 and 1971, a doctor named Eugene Saenger conducted what became known as the Cincinnati radiation experiments. The subjects were cancer patients at Cincinnati General Hospital, most of them poor, a disproportionate number of them African American. They received full-body radiation doses ranging from 25 to 300 rads. The stated purpose was to study how soldiers might perform under battlefield nuclear exposure conditions. The radiation was not, as you might imagine, therapeutic. The patients were not told that the primary purpose of the treatment was military research. Several died within days or weeks of the exposure. Their families were not informed of the true nature of the procedures. Saenger received military funding throughout this period. His research was classified. He continued to practice medicine and hold academic appointments for decades after the experiments concluded. In 1997, 3 years after his experiments became public, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the Radiological Society of North America. He died in 2007 at the age of 90. No criminal charges were ever filed against him. What pulled all of this into the open was not an institutional self-correction. It was the work of a single journalist. Eileen Welson was a reporter for the Albuquerque Tribune. In 1993, she published a series of articles in which she identified some of the plutonium injection subjects by name, a piece of investigative work that required years of cross-referencing declassified records with hospital admission documents and family interviews. The series won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 1994. More importantly, it forced the Department of Energy to respond. Secretary Hazel O'Leary ordered a comprehensive review of the department's files. What her staff found was not a small collection of isolated experiment records. It was a vast archive. Hundreds of studies, thousands of subjects, decades of classified radiation research conducted on American citizens who had not consented to participate. President Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in January of 1994 in response. The committee spent 18 months reviewing documents and taking sworn testimony from surviving subjects and their families. Its final report, released in October of 1995, documented thousands of individual radiation experiments conducted on American citizens between 1944 and 1974. The Advisory Committee's findings were not ambiguous. The committee determined that the experiments had frequently violated basic ethical standards. Consent had routinely been absent or falsified. Subjects had in many cases been specifically selected because their vulnerability reduced the likelihood of protest or future litigation. The committee recommended financial compensation for some subjects and their families. It recommended new federal guidelines on research involving human subjects. It recommended formal acknowledgement and apology. President Clinton issued the apology. He called the experiments deeply troubling. He expressed regret on behalf of the federal government. The apology was sincere in tone. It was also, in practice, almost completely without consequence. The institutions that had conducted the experiments continued to operate. The funding mechanisms that had supported them were not dismantled. The legal frameworks that had permitted them were not materially altered. And the cultural assumption inside the national security apparatus that had made the experiments possible in the first place, the assumption that some categories of Americans existed below the threshold of full human consideration, was never formally examined, named, or renounced. This is the part of the story I cannot move past. Not the experiments themselves, damning as they are, the legacy. The way the entire episode established that the United States government could use its own citizens as experimental material for 3 decades, could keep the documentation classified for half a century, and could be forced into an apology without any of the underlying machinery being dismantled. The lesson the institutions involved learned from 1994 was not that the experiments had been wrong. The lesson was that even when the documentation was finally released, the consequences would be manageable. The people who had run the programs would not face prosecution. The institutions that had hosted them would not lose their accreditation. Eugene Saenger received a gold medal 3 years after his Cincinnati experiments became public knowledge. The hospitals that had received the plutonium injection subjects continue to operate as some of the most respected medical research centers in the world. The Department of Energy, which inherited the Manhattan Project's research apparatus, still funds classified work that, by the Advisory Committee's own admission, was not fully accessible even to its own reviewers. I want to be honest about what the Advisory Committee was actually able to document and what it was not. The committee's final report stated explicitly that it could not determine the full scope of radiation experimentation on American citizens because the documentation was incomplete. Some records had been destroyed, some had never been properly maintained, some remained classified at the time of the report and were not fully made available to the committee's reviewers. The committee documented what it could access. What it could not access remained, and as far as the public record can tell us, still remains unknown. This is what the architecture of institutional suppression actually looks like. Not a single dramatic cover-up, not a single decision made by a single person to burn a single file. It is a distributed, multi-generational practice of deciding what gets recorded, what gets retained, what gets made accessible, and what gets quietly allowed to disappear. The record reflects the interests of those who controlled its creation. Those interests have never included the full and honest documentation of what was done to the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. Ebbcade's family did not learn what had happened to him until the 1990s. His injection had been classified under a subject identifier. His name was attached to the record only in internal files that were not accessible until O'Leary's review forced them into the open. When researchers finally connected the subject number to the man, his family members described the experience of learning as one of the most disorienting moments of their lives, not only because of what had been done to their relative, but because of the realization that the institution capable of doing it had never stopped operating. It had simply got better at managing what was known publicly. Albert Stevens' family did not learn that his ashes had been collected and analysed until the 1990s either. They had buried him believing his remains were his own. They were not. Samples had been retained for ongoing research. The decision to retain them had been made by researchers who considered his body a long-term scientific asset that did not expire at the moment of his death. The family had not been asked. The family had not been told. The children born to the women in the Vanderbilt prenatal study lived their entire childhoods without knowing they had been exposed to radioactive material before they were born. The ones who developed cancer did not know to connect their diagnosis to a clinical study their mothers had participated in during pregnancy. The information that would have told them was classified, and even after declassification, the process of actually connecting individual patients to individual experiments was slow, incomplete, and largely dependent on the initiative of families who already suspected something had happened and were willing to pursue the documentation themselves. Most families never knew anything had happened. Most never will. In 1994, a woman named Elmerine Whitfield Bell testified before the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. She was the daughter-in-law of Elmer Allen, a 36-year-old black railroad porter who had been injected with plutonium at the University of California in San Francisco in 1947. Allen had been admitted to the hospital after a leg injury. He was injected. 3 days later, his leg was amputated. His medical records were classified. His family was never told what had been done to him. He lived for another 4 decades with declining health that no doctor in his life ever connected to the procedure he had undergone. Family members described him as a man who had changed after 1947, who had become withdrawn, angry, and difficult to reach. He had carried something inside him that no one around him could understand because no one around him knew what had been done to him. Whitfield Bell did not soften her testimony for the committee. She told them, in plain terms, that the government had used her father-in-law. She told them he had been treated as something less than a full human being. She told them the apology being offered did not amount to accountability. She said that an apology unaccompanied by any consequence was exactly what an institution offered when it had decided that a genuine reckoning would cost more than a formal expression of regret. She was right. The committee, to its credit, included her words in its final report. The report went into the Federal Archive. The archive sits alongside the classified files that were not made fully available, even to the committee's own researchers. The institutions that ran the experiments are still funded. The mechanisms that allowed the experiments to be buried for 50 years are still operational, and the children who were given radioactive material in the 1940s, while their mothers were told they were receiving vitamins, those children, if they are still alive, are in their late 70s and 80s now. Most of them have never been formally identified, contacted, or compensated. The question is not whether what was done was wrong. Everyone agrees it was wrong. The question is what it tells us about the nature of the system that did it, and whether that system has actually changed, or whether it has simply become more careful about what gets documented and what stays out of reach. The experiments of the 1940s gave us an answer. They gave it to us in clinical documentation, in subject numbers, in measured doses and tissue samples, and in classified files that sat in government archives for half a century, while the people those files described grew old, grew sick, and died without ever knowing what had been done to them. The bones of ebbcade absorbed plutonium for the last 8 years of his life. He returned to his job, he raised his family. He had no idea what was sitting in his marrow. The institution that had put it there did. Those records remained in a locked filing cabinet for half a century while the man they described aged, weakened, and died. History is not only what happened, it is also what the people who controlled the paperwork decided you would be permitted to know.